Welcome everyone to the 6th annual Levy event at Portland State University. I'm Professor Michael Weingrad, and I'm delighted to see so many book lovers joining us for this discussion of Olga Tokarczuk's novel, The Books of Jacob. Welcome everyone. As this is a long book, I will keep my remarks brief. I want to thank once again the generosity of Larry and Pam Levy for making this event possible. I also want to thank Suzanne Van Amberg for helping to organize and publicize it. I am sorry to say that due to last-minute circumstances, Jennifer Croft is unable to join us today, but we have 3 distinguished panelists to get us thinking about the novel and guide discussion. So here's what's going to happen. We will hear 3 sets of very brief remarks of not more than 10 minutes apiece from our 3 panelists. Literary critic and biographer Ruth Franklin, author and translator Chaim Watzman, who is joining us from Jerusalem, and Professor Bojana Shallcross of the Slavics Department at the University of Chicago. In the interest of time, I will not enumerate their many, many accomplishments, but instead direct everyone to the event page for more information about these wonderful speakers. After we hear from them and they prime the pump, so to speak, you will be automatically and randomly divided into 3 groups where we will have another 40 minutes of discussion, each group guided by one of our panelists. After the 40 minutes, we will be reconvened again, and each of our panelists will briefly summarize their group's discussion. This, of course, can only be the very beginning of a conversation, of many conversations that I hope will continue beyond today's event. And so I encourage people to share emails with each other if you like through the chat room. If you are on social media, please use the hashtag Books of Jacob so that we can find each other for ongoing conversations and questions, ideas, insights, and shared passion for wonderful books and humane letters. So without further ado, let me ask Ruth Franklin to offer some reflections on the novel.
Thank you. Well, thank you, Michael. Thanks so much for inviting me here. Thanks to all of you for being here on a Sunday to discuss this really impossible to define, categorize, this unbelievable book. So I'm a book critic and biographer of Shirley Jackson, among others. I'm a book critic who has specialized periodically in writing about Polish literature. And I want to just talk a little bit, as Michael said, the book is long, our remarks will be short, but I want to talk a little bit about my interest in Polish literature, how I got that way, and how my own experiences in Poland have sort of lined up with my experience of reading the books of Jacob and how I see this novel as fitting into that. So I grew up, I'm the descendant of Polish Jews who were deported during World War II by Stalin to the Soviet Union and survived the war in a penal village in the northern Soviet Union, who then returned to Poland initially after the war, found that they had lost most of their families, and then emigrated to the US. And I grew up really with always knowing of my grandparents' love for Poland, their strong identification with Polish culture, despite, obviously the tragic way in which their story there had ended. They didn't see their relationship with Poland as having come to an end. They spoke Polish at home and with their family members. And they continue to feel very connected to it. And in fact, Olga Tokarczuk in the novel uses the term, this idea from the Middle Ages that Poland is a paradisus Judaeorum, a paradise for the Jews. And that's a term with a complicated history that is often, of course, used ironically, as Olga uses it in the novel, that the idea that people talked about Poland as a paradise for the Jews, this was not a good thing. This meant that, I think the character in the novel who uses it says that the Jews are sucking Poland dry. that Poland was a country where Jews had privileges that they didn't have elsewhere in Europe, where they could live in comfort for some centuries without being persecuted, or without much persecution, without as much persecution as elsewhere. And this was certainly the idea of Poland that I grew up with, that it was some kind of paradise of the Jews, a kind of second homeland. Of course, I grew up after the establishment of the State of Israel, which we know to be the Jewish homeland, but I had always had the impression of Poland as a second kind of Jewish homeland. And so it felt very natural to me that I wanted to live in Poland. I wanted to learn Polish as a living language, as well as a literary language. I fell in love with Polish poetry in college. And so after I graduated from college, I spent some time living in Poland, learning the language, working as a journalist, and generally trying to familiarize myself with contemporary Polish culture. What I found, this was the mid-90s when I was there, what I found was that Poland was not really a paradise for the Jews at that time. It was, as we know, it was shortly after the fall of the Iron Curtain. All the countries in Eastern and Central Europe were, sort of staggering towards democracy. There was a lot of political jockeying as everyone tried to figure out exactly where they belonged. But an interest in where Jews fit into the history of Poland and the culture of Poland was not present in Polish society at that particular moment. There was just starting to be an uptick in Jewish tourism to Poland, which of course started with the opening of Eastern Europe to tourists from the West. Many Jews from America and elsewhere were at that time, very actively seeking to return to these countries and explore the homelands of their ancestors, maybe check up on any property that had been left behind after the war. And there's not a lot of warm welcoming of this movement at the time. And, so as, a young Jewish woman in Poland, I felt pretty isolated. Growing up on the East Coast, growing up and going to college on the East Coast of the United States, I've really never been in a place before where there were so few Jews and so much hostility towards them. It was with some relief, I will confess, that I eventually returned to the US to finish my education there. And so aside actually from a brief trip that I made together with my grandfather in the early 2000s, I actually had not been back to Poland until 2019. I still felt very connected to Poland. I have many Polish friends and colleagues, and I have written a lot about Polish literature, but I hadn't actually set foot in Poland until 2019. The New Yorker assigned me to write a profile of Olga Tokarczuk, whose career I'd been following for a long time. Anybody who's interested in Polish literature knew who Olga Tokarczuk was long before her great novel Flights appeared in English translation and became such an international sensation. And I was, tremendously excited to have this opportunity, not only to meet her and spend a lot of time with her, but also to see how Poland had changed since I had, last spent any time there. And I will say that I truly could not believe my eyes when I landed in Warsaw and started walking around and becoming familiar with the city again. It was nothing like the Warsaw I had left behind in 1997 or even 2001, the last time I saw it. The city was, has become multicultural in a way that I would never have anticipated, from when, from a place where there were, only a handful of non-Polish restaurants. There is then now an explosion of the culture of basically every country you could possibly think of. And of course, most striking to me was what really felt like a true a true and in good faith willingness to reconcile with the history of the Jews in Poland. And of course, the main sign of that was the museum that opened in Warsaw in 2013. It's called the Polin Museum of the History of Polish Jews. And I'd heard about this museum. I was incredibly excited to visit it. And I found I actually wound up going there a couple of times during my brief trip because I was so moved by what I found there. And I'm going to share my screen just for a minute and show a little video that I made there. And this video shows an art installation that is the first thing that visitors see when they come into the museum. So it's a museum, for anybody who hasn't been there, it's a museum that has very beautiful, contemporary, interactive exhibits that trace the history of Jews in Poland from their arrival in the Middle Ages up through the Holocaust and the present day. So I'm going to share my screen and find this little video. 1 second. Okay, now it's not coming up in the same way. Okay, Michael, can you give me a thumbs up if this is working? Good, okay. Okay, so this is what you see as you come into the museum. It's an interactive art exhibit that shows this legend of how the Jews came to Poland. It's a legend that was retold by Agnon. So when Israel saw how its sufferings were continually renewed, how the authorities in various countries threatened them with expulsion, they sought the answer from the paths of the wide world. And a piece of paper fell from heaven, and on it the words, "Go to Polonia." So they came to the land of Poland, and God had mercy on them so that they found favor from the king and the nobles, and the king gave them permission to reside in all the lands of his kingdom. To trade over its length and breadth and to serve God according to the precepts of their religion. And the king protected them against every foe and enemy. And so the name Polin, this Jewish name for Poland, actually comes from the words Polin, rest here, and this very beautiful idea that it was in Poland that the wandering Jews would find a safe place to rest and would find a government, a ruler who would protect them. And of course, it's almost unbearably bittersweet to read this legend now, to see this in light of all that we know about what actually happened to the Jews in Poland. But the idea that this is where we start from seems so beautiful to me. And you'll remember that Olga recapitulates this novel and this moment, this little legend, this moment of the arrival of the Jews in Poland in the books of Jacob, when we see the arrival of Jacob Frank's group, and there's an allusion to this legend and the idea of Polin and rest here. And so for me, seeing this museum as a major attraction in Warsaw, and more than that, but seeing on my visits there, watching as groups of school children were walked through these exhibits and taught a very, very different narrative about the history of the Jews in Poland. not just the Holocaust, but also a narrative of centuries of coexistence and cooperation. Again, I don't want to gloss over the persecution and the bitter moments of that narrative, but that they were taught that Polish children are now being taught a narrative that includes the idea of Jews as real people with a history, not, again, what we also see in the books of Jacob, not a criminal sect that practices blood libel, but a people like any other people who lived alongside Poles and others of all ethnic groups and all nationalities, and contributed to the culture and the history of Poland. And so I'll wrap up my remarks there, and I'm happy to say more about any of this during our discussion group. But I'll just say that this idea of Polish multiculturalism is so central to the books of Jacob. And to Olga Tokarczuk's conception of Polish history more generally. And we see in the novel, we see the power of books depicted, the power of books to bring the world together and to unite different groups through education and through language. And I think it's possible even to see the writing of this book as an attempt at tikkun olam, of repairing the world and mending this tragic historical breach that has taken place between Poles and Jews. So I will wrap up there and turn it on to the next speaker, who I believe is Chaim Watzman.
Thank you so much, Ruth. Yes, we will next hear from Chaim Watzman.
Thanks. I first want to thank Michael for inviting me to take part in this discussion of the books of Jacob, a book we spoke about a long time ago and have developed a mutual enthusiasm for. It was Ruth's profile in the New Yorker in the summer of 2019 that first alerted me to Olga Tokarczuk and her work. I always take Ruth's recommendations very seriously, so I immediately ordered Jennifer Croft's translation of Flights, which bowled me over with the originality of its structure and its storytelling. Then I read Jennifer's genre-bending book, Homesick, and set my sights on the books of Jacob, but it hadn't come out in English yet. On the other hand, Miriam Borenstein's Hebrew translation was published soon thereafter, so my first reading of Tokarczuk's Polish masterpiece was in Hebrew. And now, to prepare for this discussion, I've had the pleasure of reading Jennifer's English translation. So to use Chaim Nachman Bialik's metaphor, I've kissed Tokarczuk's book twice through two different curtains, each time sensing the original in a different way, but without direct contact with the author's own language. A few words about why I find this novel so engrossing and why I think it offers lessons for how stories should be told and how novels should be written in the 21st century. The two most striking characteristics of the books of Jacob are the modesty of its prose and its construction of its protagonist. Both in Hebrew, a language in which much meaning gets packed into few words, and in English, which has an inborn inclination to wordiness, Tokarczuk's sentences come off as simple, direct, and declarative. Each sentence augments the reader's knowledge, and each one in this very long book feels essential. Yet the story is complex. The complexity comes through the interaction of these simple sentences on the levels of the paragraph, section, chapter, and the work as a whole. The parallel that comes to mind is Yasunari Kawabata's Snow Country, a short novel in which simple sentences have a powerful aggregate impact. The second thing that strikes me about this book is its construction of its protagonist. We live in an atomized age, and that's reflected in much contemporary fiction. Protagonists in so many novels and stories of the last couple of decades float in the void. We hear their voices and get into their minds as they desperately try, but largely fail, to make contact with other souls and to figure out who they are. Perhaps because I'm an observant Jew, solidly anchored in family and community, and live in a small country with a strong, if contentious, identity, I don't usually find such narratives very compelling. They seem to me to miss the most interesting thing about human existence, which is our interactions always fraught with the collective. The notable thing about the books of Jacob is that there's no single main character. The protagonist is not Nachman or Jente or Kasakowska or any of the other characters whose perspectives we're given, and certainly not Jacob Frank, whose mind remains a cipher. The protagonist of the books of Jacob is a society, specifically a segment of 18th century Eastern European Jewish society in crisis, and more generally, Eastern European society as a whole, as enlightenment and revolution make their way eastward and force people to think about themselves and their communities in new and sometimes weird ways. It becomes a society alienated from itself. To put it in the Kabbalistic terms that Frank and his cohort use, it's a world in exile, seeking a God who is also in exile. One might say that it's a novel about how all of Europe became Jewish. Long generations of Jews lived in Europe for many centuries as sojourners. They were stateless aliens in a landscape in which they and their ancestors had been born and lived out their lives. At the cusp of the modern age, Europeans as a whole began, in a sense, to feel like strangers in the lands in which they live. It's the age in which the book, in the singular, becomes the books in the plural. Reading the books of Jacob in two different translations heightens this sense of alienation, perhaps in ways that Tokarczuk could not have imagined. Still, she knew very well that she was writing about a society that, while it lived in her landscape, did not share her language or her way of thinking or communal customs. Bornstein's Hebrew translation, which was edited by two scholars, comes off as more Jewish. It uses folk and rabbinic and Kabbalistic terms and phrases and concepts that impart a wealth of associations to the Hebrew reader that a reader in Polish or other languages simply will not get. Jennifer's English translation by nature connects the book to European literature in ways that the Hebrew doesn't. I should add that during my first reading in Hebrew, I was so fascinated by the book's style and structure and storytelling that I was less critical of its details. Tokarczuk creates a convincing portrayal of her fictional society and its members, but is it an accurate representation of the actual historical Frankist movement and the communities it was in contact with? I'm not sure that on a purely literary level that really makes a difference. But I think that Tokarczuk misses two essential elements of the fabric of Jewish life in the 18th century and beyond. The first is the cycle of observances and holidays that pervades every level of Jewish life, both in its rabbinic and anti-rabbinic forms. There's no Shabbat in her book, no Pesach, no Yom Kippur, no clear picture of how Frankist practices played off and parodied traditional ones. Second, she misses the textual nature of Jewish discourse. I'm no expert on Sabbatianism or Frankism or Hasidism, but I find it hard to believe that the Baal Shem Tov's students engage in abstract metaphysical speculation. Jews argue by explicating texts. You wouldn't know that from the books of Jacob. My guess is that Tokarczuk chose to write about the Frankists because the movement was perhaps the most radical and off-the-wall example of border crossing in an 18th century Europe in which boundaries between nations and religions and philosophies were being stretched and breached. The partition of Poland becomes a political metaphor for this larger phenomenon. As a secularized post-World War II and post-communist Pole, she is clearly interested, as the final part of the book in particular brings out, in how Frankism ended up pretty much everywhere in the West. In that sense, it is a book of modern Europe and pan-European identity. But for me, a Jewish and Israeli reader, what is most interesting is not how borders are eliminated, but how they get rewoven in new fabrics, each with its own characteristic ability to reveal and to conceal. Thanks.
Thank you so much, Chaim. And our third speaker, I would like to invite Professor Bożena Shallcross to share her remarks with us. Bożena, you're currently muted, so sorry, I don't think we...
Okay,
right.
Thank you so much. My reading is an attempt at restoring a metaphysical aspect of this fascinating novel. How to handle such vastness, asks Father Benedict Chmielowski, one of several characters in the books of Jacob based on people from Polish and Polish Jewish history. The historical Chmielowski, who was born in 1700 and died in 1763, is best known for having written the first Polish encyclopedia. His fictional counterpart confronts in his operatic music the capacious genre of the encyclopedia. The 4 volumes that he managed to publish bear a long title. I am quoting New Athens, or the Academy full of science, divided into subjects and classes, for the wise ones to record, for the idiots to learn, for the politicians to practice, for the melancholics to entertain. The vastness that Chmielowski contemplates is unfathomable in size, consisting of both phenomenal and nominal fantastic worlds to be conveyed in print. Father Chmielowski takes seriously the existence of various noumena. For example, he claims that, I'm quoting, dragons exist for sure. It is not his belief in the fantastic world that I find amusing, but rather the fact that its vastness added to the Heideggerian present at hand vastness, which Chmielowski imagines as all mankind knowledge collected in one place, results in an even vaster vastness that is their idealized sum. The one place Father Chmielowski had in mind is, of course, his big 4-volume long encyclopedia. Behind the ambitious compendium project lurks his fear of, I'm quoting, a collapse of all the things that haven't been yet named. And this fear mobilizes all sorts of his actions and projects. I see the possibility of viewing Chmielowski's curatorial and authorial question about the challenge of total representation as analogous to the one Tokarczuk might have asked herself when composing her mega novel. How should I deal with such an antique monumentality? Tokarczuk granted an overarching prominence to detail, its accretion and its depiction, linearly organizing details, almost microscopically defining human beings and the world of their objects in all their visible aspects. She engages the machine of ekphrasis, of depicting an object not as it is understood today as depictions of works of art, but as understood by ancient rhetoricians as a textual recreation of any visual aspect of reality. Her ekphrastic reconstruction of all things visible is accompanied in the novel by lists that do not discriminate among fragments, remains, crumbs, or scraps, to employ a term used in the novel by Naaman Samuel Ben-Levi, one of the chroniclers of Frank's deeds. She characterizes the role of compiling such lists in Naaman's writing as, I'm quoting, in essence, tikkun, the repair of the world, including holes in its fabric so filled with overlapping patterns, squiggles, tangles, trails, unquote. Tokarczuk's adaptation of the Kabbalistic principle of tikkun proposes studying books and rearranging the words in them to find the proper meaning. She goes so far as to formulate out of this principle a guideline to her readers. And so she says, this is how to view this strange pursuit of Naaman, unquote. So advised, the novel's connection between the microscopic and the macroscopic is often anchored in the body. Naaman puts it thus, quoting, even the most minimal movement of my head revealed mystery. Every blade of grass belonged to this deep system of meaning, its indispensable aspect of the vastness of this world. Built intelligently and perfectly, the tiniest thing connected with the greatest. This reassuring connectivity between the smallest and the largest happens also to organize the space and its diverse interiorities. Again, quoting, the world is simply the multiplication of the Zurum in the Shores-Rachatenhon above the market square. Through the slits in the curtains and the haphazardly nailed door, starlight seeps in, which means that even the stars are close acquaintances, that some forbear or cousin must certainly have had some close contact with them. Say one word in the room in Rohatyn, and soon it will be carried all around the world. Tokarczuk's big book seems, as it in a dream, liberated from the constraints of time and space, able to contain seemingly impossible combinations within its vastness. Meanings are revealed in the milk that spilled into the shape of the letter, or in the imprint of horse hoof in the shape of another letter. And the whole book is a book written by God. All-encompassing eye of Jente learns the above lesson in her early childhood. In her older age, Jente, one of the characters in the novel, is positioned above the earth and in the earth of the cave, suspended between life and death with an omniscience like God's. Jente's vision encompasses the barely visible specks of dirt and the sublime beauty of mountains, everything within the phenomenal and nominal vastness. Immanuel Kant describes such an ordering principle in the introduction to the Critique of the Power of Judgment, defining the power of judgment as the capacity to think the particular as contained under the universal. Frederick Jameson, in his review of Tokarczuk's novel, attributes this idea to James Joyce, but it is in fact a Kantian derivation. This faculty of judgment recognizes the particular as reflected in the universal, and as such as it is paramount for ordering Tokarczuk's narrative and for defining how its characters, especially Jente, Chmielowski, and Naman, comprehend the world. While the manner of discovering a detail in the universal is adequate to the novel's general representational power, often through metonymy, one of its characters escapes this Kantian ordering, and it is the mysterious Jacob Frank. Naman, his close companion, his scribe and chronicler, considers him inscrutable, unknowable. It seems that this medieval formula, according to which the human body becomes a manifestation or exemplum of reality as a whole, does not apply to the false messiah's bodily architectonics. Franks presents a considerable challenge to historians such as Krauser and Pacheco, and to Tokarczuk in her attempt to fictionalize him. Although she gives him voice and through Naman allows mediated access to his interiority, Frank, the novelized representation, seems ultimately to be beyond her grasp, and it is by the novelist's design. I would like to explore Franks's famous impulsivity, which blocked and denied an important function of his subjectivity. It is the capacity to observe oneself and thereby develop a discerning and self-aware consciousness. To portray Frank honestly, Tokarczuk brilliantly employs a behavioral characterization as predetermined by his body in the form of his spasmodic and epileptic bodily rhythm. His epileptic fits overlapping with epiphanic moments remind me of Karin in Ingmar Bergman's 1961 phenomenal movie, Through a Glass Darkly, in which her mystical and cognitive experience is equated with slipping into madness. Bergman seems to owe a lot to Dostoevsky's construal of Prince Myshkin in The Idiot, especially in one of its culminating scenes in the novel, when Mishkin, in an epileptic fit, has a sudden epiphanic vision of love as beauty. Like Berman's Karin, after an epiphanic experience, Mishkin was unable to return to life outside an asylum. Frank, however, after imprisonments, returns to the community, although to inhabit one anxious or intense space after another. His desire for a safe place for all Jews eventually deteriorates into a form of greed. Frank's conversion and acculturation to Polish Catholic nobility is a major change in the borders of his selfhood. The community of downtrodden Jews finds in Frank's pulsating selfhood not just a guide, but a doxa that reveals the all-encompassing elements of their reality, the universality of suffering. While his body is flung to and fro in fornication, feasts, altercations, as well as in rituals, debates, or years of wandering, it finds nothing solid except an occasional participation in a collective experience of suffering and sometimes elation. Frank, in discovering this, exists beyond personal limitations. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Bożena. Thank you to all three of our panelists for three wonderful, wonderful sets of lines of inquiry into this book. So different, mutually complementary, reinforcing, and so I'm really excited to continue this conversation in our separate groups. Our wonderful technicians will shortly divide us randomly into these three groups. And so I myself don't know where I will be, but you should be getting an invitation very shortly, and just click to join and let's talk. Welcome back, everyone. I'm sure we just touched on the very, very tiniest tip of this extraordinary iceberg, but I am looking forward to hearing from each of our panelists about what went on in their group. I just want to start off by saying something that occurs to me that I didn't bring up, but I'll take moderators or organizers' privilege and just throw out a thought that on the one hand, the novel, certainly in its contemporary political context, is very much seen justifiably as an expression of a kind of humane multiculturalism. And at the same time, I think it's interesting that in the events of the novel, as they connect with the history of the Frankist movement and their very bitter conflicts with what are called the rabbinic or the Talmudist Jews, normative Judaism for the time, there may be a direction that cuts against that, in the sense that the Jewish community in Poland appeals to these larger transnational powerful structures to step in and solve their problems, punish their enemies, give official status to one group or the other. I'm talking about primarily the church, which plays out politically today in rather a different direction, in the sense of what has been happening in Polish politics and the tensions between the ruling Conservative Party in Poland and the EU. So I just want to throw that out as a way in which this large novel that contains so much may actually contain political trajectories that don't necessarily conform to a more progressive narrative, but may warn about some of the problems with globalism, multiculturalism, international liberalism at the same time. So I think it's a testimony to how much is in here. But why don't we begin with Bojana to talk about the group that I was privileged to be in, and then we'll go to Chaim and end with Ruth.
Can you hear me? Okay, so thank you, Michael. Yes, indeed, we found this novel to have this additional benefit that sort of stimulates our attention and points to how the novel and its ideology resonates with the contemporary Polish situation and its changes, because the situation on the ground there is really evolving. I would like to say that one of the most disquieting experiences for Tokarczuk, not only for her, but for her as well, was the attack at the institutions of democracy in Poland. And this attack included, well, among others, the Polin Museum, where, you know, the Minister of Education and Culture, blah, blah, could not nominate for almost a year the proper and properly elected head, because Mariusz Stola did not follow Gliński, the minister's notion of the rightist political correctness. Tokarczuk, of course, is very much a multiculturalist, and thank you for bringing this term to the fore, to this discussion. But she also wants to point the absurdities of this noble idea, and she likes to dwell in small homelands, and her place near the Polish-Czech border, her house there near Kłodzko in the so-called Lower Silesia, was such a place. It was a place that combined the possibility of recreating the rich tradition of that land, and she does it in the house of night, the house of day. But I also would like to mention that she was born in what is actually Pomerania, that is to the north of Lower Silesia, one of those territories that because of Stalin were given to Poles to compensate, I don't know what, for maybe Ukraine. It was really a satanic idea to move millions of people, among them Tokarczuk's family. So she grew up among people who actually were born in the Polish Ukraine. And she does not adopt, and never has accepted their dream of, let's say, Lwów being Polish again. She has her own very strong perspective on the Polish-Ukrainian relationship, not just Polish-Jewish. So she, for example, hired as her secretary, personal secretary, assistant, and as also a part of the person who takes care of her foundation, a young writer from Ukraine. So you can imagine the hate letters that she receives, that she didn't hire a Polish person, that she hired somebody from Ukraine. Even now, when Poles are unexpectedly giving a huge support beyond their means to the Ukrainian war refugees, even now there are people who are xenophobes, who represent everything that she's trying to fight. And that novel, The Books of Jacob, I think shows what is her dream. That is, it would be a dream of, of multi-ethnic and multicultural and multinational community, the one that the EU is trying to employ. But as we know, many polls are against it, including the current government and the current leading party.
Great, thank you. Thank you. Chaim, would you please share with us some of what your group talked about? You're muted.
Yes.
There we go.
Since Bojana touched on the multiculturalism and added a lot of interesting information, I'm not going to touch on that. That issue did come up in our group. One thing that came up was just there were some people who were reading the book in small packages and feeling that they needed a little rest between it, and other people who were reading it in long bursts of reading. And I thought that was interesting because I think it says something about the way the book is structured that makes both those kinds of readings possible and valuable, and maybe different in certain ways. Another interesting idea that came up was one participant talked about the importance of language in the book and how much it's a polyglot world that these characters inhabit. And I think that's very interesting when we talk about we're not talking about a world that is becoming multicultural in the sense of modern, say, European Union multiculturalism. It's a world that is already multicultural by the fact of the mixing of peoples, by the fact that the Turkish Ottoman Empire rules a large chunk of Eastern Europe. And Frank represents that. Frank is an Ashkenazi-born Jew from an Ashkenazi family whose mother tongue is Turkish and whose sacred tongue is Ladino, which are not his family tradition, but because his family moved to Turkey as part of the Sabbatean move there, he grew up with those languages. One interesting thing that we started talking about that we didn't really get to pursue that I thought is the question of whether is the Frankism that's portrayed in the novel as a religious movement, is it coherent? And personally, I don't think it is. I think it's a mess intellectually. And the Kabbalah as presented in the book is a very shallow version of Kabbalah. And I don't know, and I don't know if it's even important, whether this is deliberate on Tokarczuk's part. Is she basing herself on Gershom Sholom's portrayal of Frank as a charlatan and an ignoramus who didn't really know Kabbalah and didn't know Jewish texts and didn't know much about anything except how to get on in life? That's a portrayal that was, I think, the common wisdom for many years, but I think as modern, current scholarship has challenged that. Or is Tokarczuk simply unable or unwilling to invest the time in mastering these Kabbalistic ideas, which I don't think there's any sin in that. It's a life study and not something that one can master in just by reading a couple of books. And I leave that as an open question. To what extent is the portrayal of Frankism as a mess and a collection of disparate individuals with disparate intentions and ideas and desires all following this charismatic figure. Is that part of what the book's about? I think my tendency is to think that is the case. And I think that's it.
Thank you. And finally, Ruth.
Well, I'll be quick since I see we're running over time. I just want to say I had a wonderful group from all over the place, people from Santa Fe, the Midwest, Pacific Northwest, a couple people from Israel. Everybody who spoke had such interesting observations to make about this book. And I want to congratulate and thank you all, because it's not everybody who chooses to undertake a really challenging novel like this as part of a book group. I had several members of a book group in my discussion group. So thanks to all of you for being here and for reading this novel so seriously and carefully. We talked a little bit about how one approaches a historical novel. What does it mean? How do we address the question of believability in this context? What does it mean for such a novel to be believable in the sense of, does that mean convincing the reader that the events that took place could have happened in the way that they did? Or is it more a question of reproducing the texture of the time through all the little details, the sensual details, the visual descriptions, the smells, and all the other elements from her research that Tokarczuk brings to the novel. We talked a little bit about Jacob Frank as a character and how we're meant to perceive him. Is he a charlatan, a fake? How does the novel see him, and how do we see him as readers? We talked a little bit about the question of whether the Books of Jacob is a Jewish novel, and what it means for a novel to be Jewish in that sense. A couple of people, we seem to agree perhaps that it's not a Jewish novel, but rather it's a novel that Jews are interested in. It's a book that approaches an important moment in Polish Jewish history and culture from a very particular standpoint. Is more of a philosophical and theological book than a Jewish one. And finally, I raised a question that preoccupies me, not just in the context of this book, but especially so, of whether what we are meant to take from the books of Jacob in our current contemporary moment. Could a messianic movement like Jacob Frank's arise today? Perhaps it is already. What does the book have to tell us about the idea of such messianic movements, about the figure of the Messiah, and about the phenomenon of waiting for a Messiah and what that means to a group of people? And yeah, the point of that, whether that messiahs tend to arise at moments of social tension, when people are feeling desperate and hopeless. And in fact, we see something of the messianic tendency in some of the political figures of today who have particular cults of personality around them. And yeah, with that, I will wrap it up. It was a fantastic discussion, and I'm sorry that it couldn't go on for longer.
Thank you, Ruth. Likewise, I really want to thank all three of our wonderful panelists, and thank all of you for the privilege of hearing from you, getting to read with you, and here's to more reading across the world, more wonderful books, more wonderful people reading those books and sharing their perspectives on them. And I thoroughly enjoyed myself and hope you had a good time too. So we'll end there.